We now have Arjan Post, who is a PhD student at Utrecht University. His PhD is on Imad al-Din al-Wasiti, who was a Sufi student of Ibn Taymiyya. Al-Wasiti died in 711, if I'm not mistaken. And Arjan is given a paper whose title is Ibn Taymiyya versus the Shādhiliyya, a Refutation and its Impact. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for having me here, and John Hoover for inviting me for this panel. I will go on right away because time is sparse. So my presentation, Ibn Taymiyya versus the Shādhiliyya, is actually a topic that I was thinking about before I was doing my PhD. It's actually quite funny. Years ago, I was in Rabat in Morocco, and I found this book where Ibn Taymiyya refutes the Shādhiliyya. And it occurred to me that as I saw the title, that I was doubting its authenticity, because for some reason I thought, no, why would Ibn Taymiyya refute the Shādhiliyya? And this sparked some interest in me, because I thought, why do I have this feeling that this would make this work possibly inauthentic and wrongly attributed to him? So a few years later, when I started my PhD and I wanted to do something about Ibn Taymiyya and Sufism, I was thinking, hey, what if I look at this refutation against Shādhili? And as I will as I will explain in a minute, I found that it is indeed authentic. But through looking at Ibn Taymiyya's relationship and his refutation against the Shādhiliyya, I found that actually one of his own pupils, Imad al-Din al-Wasiti, just mentioned by Caterina Bori, was himself actually a Shādhili. And this is something I will come back to. But this is also how I came to my final topic for my PhD. So in a sense, this was my original topic, and it's brought me to the topic that I'm working on right now. So I'm quite happy to present it here for you, so that at least the work that I did about 4 years ago on this, it was not in vain. So the presentation outline quickly will be as follows. I will start by looking at the refutation itself. I will give some background about the authenticity, and I will also get into the contents of the refutation and go through some of the arguments given by Ibn Taymiyya. And the second part of the talk, I will get into the impact of the refutation. Now, it is quite difficult to really reconstruct how the refutation was received, but there are a few hints in the literature that I found that are quite interesting and give room for some interesting speculation, I think, which I will present in the conclusion. So to begin, first off, the refutation itself is published as رد على شاذلي في حزبيه وما صنفه في آداب الطريق. There are actually two editions, but I consulted the edition of Ali ibn Muhammad al-Imran. The first edition, I did not have access to it, but I found some time ago that it's based on the same manuscript. And it appears that there is only one manuscript that has been found so far, and this manuscript was actually copied by someone during the lifetime of Ibn Taymiyya, five years, I think, before Ibn Taymiyya passed away. So this is also something to keep in mind for the conclusion. Regarding its authenticity. Is actually quite certain that it is authentic, because it's mentioned by, for instance, Ibn Abdul Hadi, a student of Ibn Taymiyya, who gives a list of titles of Ibn Taymiyya's works. And furthermore, there are several references throughout the fatwas of Ibn Taymiyya and several writings of his, where he also indirectly attacks Shādhili with the same arguments that he gives also in the Rad. So this makes it very clear that it is indeed authentic. And actually, in the introduction, the editor gives also very good overview of evidence for this. So if we move on to the context of the composition, it is difficult to find why exactly Ibn Taymiyya wrote it. In what context? Because he never really explicitly tells us, but there are a few hints that I believe do give us some important information in that regard. It is my theory that it must have been written between 1299 and 1306, and I will present the evidence for that now. On page 1415 of the Refutation. He says that there are among the students of Shādhiliyya certain people who believe that the Prophet passed on a certain divine secret, a mystical secret that was passed on from generation to generation until it reached Shādhiliyya himself. And then he says, and I quote, "One of the eminent men among the madrasa instructors, the mudarrisin, who reached Damascus, would mention this and disclose it to those of his learned companions he associated with, until they informed me of it. Now this person would associate with me, so I explained the corruption of these words to him and what they contain that deviates from the religion of Islam." So there was apparently someone who was knowledgeable in some sense about Shādhiliyya and perhaps the Shādhiliyya, and this was apparently a source for Ibn Taymiyya. But who was this mudarris? There are two names that I found that may have been him. One is Kamaluddin Umar al-Maraghi, who was mentioned once or twice by Ibn Taymiyya. He's mentioned twice in Haqiqat Madhab al-Ittihadiyin, Ibn Taymiyya's refutation of Ibn Arabi and his school. And he cites him because al-Maraghi gives a quote from Abul Abbas al-Mursi, the second sheikh of the Shādhiliyya. So this gives the impression that this al-Maraghi was somehow connected to the Shādhiliyya. However, I think that it was rather Imaduddin Ahmad al-Wasti. And why is that? Imaduddin al-Wasti, towards the end of the 13th century, actually lived in Alexandria for a while, where he joined the Shādhiliyya. And we know that he was quite well informed of the doctrine of the Shādhiliyya. And it would very well have been possible that he took some of the writings attributed to Shādhiliyya to Damascus when he traveled there. And he was also a mudarris. He lived in one of the Hanbali madrasas in the old city, where he taught Sufism, or suluk as he rather calls it. So I would say that it could very well have been al-Wasti. And we know that he entered Damascus towards the end of the 13th century. I believe that it would have been between the time that al-Wasti entered Damascus and the moment Ibn Taymiyya left for Egypt, that this refutation could very well have already been written. Of course, it could also have been in Egypt afterwards, but I would not be surprised that it was rather in Damascus already, because in one of al-Wasiti's treatises, he actually gives an argument against Shādhiliyya that is also given by Ibn Taymiyya in the Rad. As for the contents of the refutation, we can divide the book roughly into two parts. The first part is only concerned with two litanies of Shādhiliyya, the Hizb al-Bahr and the Hizb al-Bar. It's evident that Ibn Taymiyya was much more concerned with the second part of the refutation, which is a refutation of a passage from a very small treatise attributed to Shādhiliyya, which is actually published in Ibn al-Sabbah's Duratul Asrar, a Shādhiliyya sheikh from the beginning of the 14th century, if I'm correct. And this is really the place where Ibn Taymiyya goes full out against Shādhiliyya and really tries to show that he is in fact hinting at something that he calls ittihad, unification between God and the servant, or hulul, where God incarnates in the servant. To briefly give a few examples of how his refutation of the Hizb al-Bahr and Hizb al-Bar are not as serious as the second part of the book. He says, for instance, that the Hizb al-Bahr is written by Shādhiliyya as a plea towards God to help him as he was going on a journey on the sea. So he said, how can someone recite this litany while he is on land? That's preposterous. And other arguments are, for instance, that there is a line in the Hizb where Shādhiliyya says towards God, نسألك العصمة في الحركات, and isma is we could translate it as protection, but Ibn Taymiyya he views it as the protection of the prophets, because in Islamic theology the dominant opinion is that the prophets are protected against sin, ma'soom. And he says, how can a Shādhili ask to be protected when it's only the prophets who are divinely protected? And regarding the Hizb al-Kabir, or Hizb al-Bar, as it is also known, he says that he sometimes gives a Shādhili the benefit of the doubt. He says, if he means this and this, then that would be okay, but if he means this and this, then that's completely wrong. But his main complaint here is that a Shādhili mixes words of the revelation, and he takes them out of their context and out of their place, which Ibn Taymiyya finds repulsive, because this is not something that ought to be done. But now we go to the juicy part, which is the second part of the book. And here we find Ibn Taymiyya really putting in effort to show that Shādhili was something of a monist or a unificationist, like an Ibn Arabi type Sufi. Here are a few interesting quotes that I collected. He cites Shādhili saying, then he says, as for the path that is peculiar to the beloved ones, it is from him, i.e. God, unto him, by him, since it is impossible to arrive unto him by something other than him. It is said in reply, if he had said it is by him unto him, then that would be true, for God can only be served with his aid. However, he says it is from him unto him, and this is the kind of statement made by those who profess monism, Ahl al-Wahda, and that is basically the school of Ibn Arabi. Just to take in account time, I will only read the last citation here, where he again looks at one of Shādhili's statements, and he says, his statement, he looked at his essence from his essence in his essence, agrees with the school of the monists, again Madhab Ahl al-Wahda, who proclaim that God is the manifest, al-Zahir, in all creatures, and that his essence looks at his essence. And this is a classical type of argument of the Taymiyyan circle. Not only Ibn Taymiyya, but also al-Wasti uses this to refute Ibn Arabi and his likes. Now we turn to the second part of my talk, which is about the impact of the refutation. And there are a few interesting things to be found. First, I think we have to view this in a little bit of context as well. And there has been some recent work that is quite important regarding the Shādhiliyya in the early Mamluk period, because it is very clear that there was something as Eric Geoffroy calls it, a marriage between Ash'arism and Sufism. And as John Hoover just noted regarding the Ash'ari school, they were quite hard when it comes to those they considered to be Mujassim anthropomorphists. And at the same time, this caused something of a tension between Ibn Taymiyya and those Sufis who were attached to the Ash'ari school. And the same goes, for instance, for al-Wasti, by the way, who distances himself later on in his life from the Shādhiliyya, because he says they are mutakallimun, and he means that they are Ash'aris, evidently. So it is important to view the Shādhiliyya and in the context of this marriage between Sufism and Ash'arism, because they were one of the most successful Sufi orders in the early Mamluk period, and they were really considered to be the carriers of orthodox Sufism, to use this problematic term. Now, to continue to the impact of the refutation, it has already been argued by Nathan Hoffer that it's very well possible that when Ibn Ata'illah stood up against Ibn Taymiyya, that this may have been motivated by this refutation, and that Ibn Ata'illah was aware of this refutation. Ibn Ata'illah is one of the most important sheikhs in the Shādhiliyya due to the fact that he was the first to write books on Sufism in accordance with the method of Shādhili, as he at least claims it. So that's the first possibility, and I think that is indeed plausible, considering the fact that the Rat was probably already written in Damascus. And second, we find that there's something of we can find something of a genealogy of awareness among Shādhili affiliates who were somehow affiliated with the Shādhiliyya or really admired the Shādhiliyya, whom in their tabaqat works, their works of history, make notes of Ibn Taymiyya's refutation. So as a few to name these examples, we have Al-Yafi'i, who was a Shafi'i and a Sufi and a very strict Ash'ari. He says regarding Ibn Taymiyya, among the most repulsive concerns of his writings is his criticism of the sheikhs who know God, the Arifin, or Gnostics, such as, and he names several sheikhs, among whom Sheikh Abul Hasan al-Shādhili. The second is Ibn al-Mulaqin, who was initiated into the Shādhiliyya, we know. And he says one of the Hanbalis declared war against him, Shādhili, and that is without a doubt Ibn Taymiyya. And the last one we have here is Ash-Sha'rani, who says that Ibn Taymiyya aimed his arrow at him, Shādhili, and refuted him. So obviously there was an awareness amongst the Shādhiliyya and their affiliates, and they were bothered by this refutation. But there are two examples in particular that I want to highlight, because both actually, in a sense, reply to Ibn Taymiyya. The first of these is Ahmad Zarruq, who was also attached to the Shādhiliyya, and he has two commentaries that he wrote one regarding Hizb al-Bahr and one on the Hizb al-Bahr and Hizb al-Bar. And in the Sharh Hizb al-Bahr, for instance, he explicitly mentions Ibn Taymiyya and says he refuted the Hizb al-Bahr, but that is because he was learned, but he had no understanding. Let alone that he had any ma'rifah, divine knowledge, he simply misunderstood these words. But he has a very interesting thing that he says in the introduction of his Sharh Ghawamid Hizbiyya Shādhili, where he says, and I quote, "In all regions, the generality of the later scholars, in fact all the people in these times, have agreed to approve of these litanies and put them in practice, save one whose prosperity decreased and who was overcome by the effects of tribulation. But now the arrows of disavowal are aimed at him from another direction, and the harm of his own disavowal will come back at him, and his shortcoming in all he related will backfire. Soon the truth will be known from falsehood, and the one who is serviceable will be clearly distinguished from the one who is destitute." And I'm quite sure that this was aimed at Ibn Taymiyya, and there was probably something in here that where he refers indirectly towards the fate of Ibn Taymiyya, how he died in prison, which he probably saw as something of divine retribution for his attacks against Shādhili. That's at least how I would read this. The second treatise that was, I think, also in reaction to Shādhili, to Ibn Taymiyya's refutation of Shādhili, is Jalaluddin al-Suyuti's تأييد الحقيقة العلية وتشهير طريقة الشاذلية. And here there are several occasions where he highlights that Shādhili is completely free from professing hulul or ittihad. And he says, for instance, if you examine the books of the respected Sufis, such as the Risala of Qushayri and others like it, the words of Shādhili and the books of Ibn Ata'illah, you will not find any word of hulul or ittihad in them. And if the word wahda, which is like the word referring to the school of Ibn Arabi as the monist school, occurs in their words, then they mean tawheed and not ittihad. So he really tries to make a case for the Shādhiliyya as a true Sufi order that is free of any ittihad and hulul. And although he does not mention Ibn Taymiyya, clearly he saw that this argument of ittihad and hulul needed to be refuted. So to come to the conclusion, what is the place of the Rad in Ibn Taymiyya's oeuvre? I would say that it's part of his activism to purify, among other Sufism, just as he tried to purify theology of the Kalam influences, he tried to purify Sufism of those matters that he considered to be newly introduced on the basis of philosophy or Kalam theology. And also, I think in his contact with Sufis such as Imad ad-Din al-Wasi. As for the impact of the refutation, I think that we should take into account the important position of the Shādhiliyya in the Mamluk context, where they were considered as the paragon of the true Sufis, or as Suyuti actually says it, the inheritors of the way of Junayd. And that this may also be why the Rad was not really favored, and and here we enter, of course, speculation, but the mere fact that there was only one manuscript, and that this was a manuscript written during the lifetime of Ibn Taymiyya, could point to the notion that a refutation of such a well-respected sheikh, that people were not very eager to copy it, so that there were not many copies produced. So the fate of the Rad was perhaps influenced by this Shādhili position, and in that sense gives an interesting insight in the way that Ibn Taymiyya may have stepped over the line in a sense here, and taken up his tried to refute a Sufi whose authority as a saintly figure was simply so well established that a refutation against him was not favored amongst his contemporaries. That's it for me. Thank you.